Okay, confession. When I was 13 or so, I read this factoid, and it must have been on like cracked.com or something. And it said that people who were good at the arts were likely to be just as good at sciences. And I'm pretty sure that's why I majored in neuroscience. What's up, guys? Welcome to Meg Talks Science. I'm Meg. I talk about science, and today we are going to be talking about the arts versus STEM divide. So, is it possible that STEM students are smarter than art students? And my answer to that is no. So, if that's all you're interested in, you can stop watching the video. That's the answer. But if you would like to find out why, then maybe you can keep going. So, you're alive in the year of our Lord 2025. And you've heard about this STEM versus humanities divide. I mean, we all know that hashtag women in STEM are constantly battling mansplaining, sexism, and arts girlies alike. And to me, it's that last one that I really have an issue with, because there's no real reason for the STEM students and the art students to have this big divide. It seems arbitrary to me. So I did my undergrad in neuroscience a couple years ago, and then I went back for my master's. So I feel perfectly positioned to talk about this divide and how absolutely ridiculous it is. As a STEM grad, I'm here to say STEM grads are just as dumb as anyone else, or, arts grads are just as smart as anyone else. But what is this STEM versus humanities divide? Like, what is the basis of it? So according to the small Google rabbit hole that I started down, and I'll link all my sources that I talk about in the description below, so if you're interested in any of them, you can check them out. But Bailey and colleagues did this study that found that undergraduates tend to believe that STEM fields require this innate level of brilliance that art fields simply don't. So this basically means that undergraduates tend to think that you need to be supernaturally smart to succeed in certain fields. And this idea also seems to have permeated into pop culture. I mean, we've all heard of like the mad scientist, the genius scientist. Doc Brown is both of them at the same time. So I think that we're all used to seeing these like caricatures of really, really intelligent people who become scientists. And I just don't, not to say that scientists aren't smart, but I think that we're about as smart or dumb, genuinely, as anyone else. I mean, we've all met STEM grads, honestly. I personally love my STEM friends and obviously like women in STEM here. But unless we're measuring like unintentional fires started, I don't think that that's really a good grasp on how we should define intelligence anyway. But I do consider myself somewhat of a scientist. So I decided to do, like I said, a bit of a Google Scholar rabbit hole to see what the literature actually says about this. So that brings us to part one of this video. Are STEM students actually smarter than humanities grads? Now, I couldn't find a recent study that just straight up compared IQs between STEM and humanities grads, and I'm sure that would be super easy to collect participants for. But fortunately for us, there is a decent body of research concerning what makes someone actually enter a STEM program versus a humanities program, and how this relates to general intelligence. So, what does it say? Now, a lot of this research comes down to research done by Thomas Coyle, a researcher in Texas, and his work has landed on the idea of ability tilt. So ability tilt is, as the name suggests, when your abilities are tilted towards one domain or another. And the original research investigated a lot of STEM, so like math abilities versus humanities, so verbal abilities. And you can be tilted towards either side of it. Ability tilt can be easily identified by, if you're American, looking at your SAT or ACT scores. Basically, whichever side was larger is your tilt. If you're not American, you can just kind of think like, do I like math? Do I like English? Or, well, reading? Do I like words? That type of thing. You pretty much end up having preferences based on your tilt pretty fast. And possibly your tilt is based on preferences. I, of course, am strange. And so if you use the SAT method to actually determine your ability tilt, for my last SAT, I ended up getting the same score on each subsection. But before that, I did tend to actually have a bit of a verbal tilt myself, despite going into STEM. So how does this relate? How does tilt relate to what I was saying earlier? Basically, Coyle and colleagues have found that ability tilt tends to predict college major and eventual jobs. Basically, if you have a verbal tilt, you typically end up going into the humanities. And then if you have a math tilt, you typically end up going into something STEM-like. And this ends up influencing the kinds of jobs you get. So verbal tilt, humanities, you might end up being a lawyer. STEM tilt, or math tilt, sorry, then you go into STEM. And then you might end up being like an engineer or something. Interestingly, and in answer to our question of whether intelligence or general intelligence differs between these two groups, Coyle actually found that IQ was no different based on tilt. So basically, whether or not you were good at math or good at language, that your total score was unrelated to this tilt. Instead, tilt tends to predict where you're going to go, as I said earlier, and your general intelligence will be a better predictor of how well you do when you get there. So to answer our original, if silly question of whether STEM grads are actually smarter than the humanities people, the answer is no. But I was interested in what actually determines your tilt direction, and thus whether you're allowed to like dress dark academia or whether you have to wear, leggings and a hoodie for the rest of your life. While there's not necessarily a consensus in the research, Coyle and colleagues have put forward an idea of investment. So this is based on like investment theories of intelligence, which go back to that whole like growth mindset that you may have heard of, which is basically that the more you put into certain skills, the better you get at them. And then you learn more about those things, and eventually you come to enjoy those things. Personally, I think that this is relatively neutral in the grand scheme of like theories about intelligence. However, I do think that the evidence is a little bit thin to conclude that investment is the only thing that makes these differences. However, I do have to admit that like personal anecdote incoming here, but my SAT scores with a sample size of 1, so take it with a lump of salt, kind of provide compelling testimony for investment theory and how this investment might affect tilt. So I used to not really like math all that much. I just never enjoyed it. It wasn't my thing. I really preferred English and reading and language. And then for my junior year of high school, so my second to last year for all you Europeans, I ended up taking twice as many math classes as I needed to take. And this really, really improved my math skills, honestly. If you look at my SAT scores from the time, I went from like total verbal till I was great at verbal, terrible at math, and it just shot right up. So thank you pre-cal and AP statistics for that. Honestly, taking that much math was a bit of a stretch for my brain, but I ended up really not hating math as much as I had, and now I kind of welcome the challenge, So who knows, maybe the whole investment theory is perfectly sound and I'm just a critic. However, one other thing that Coyle uncovered was that tilt is heavily sex biased. So about 60% of males tended to be tilted towards the math side of things, and about 60% of females ended up being tilted towards the more verbal reasoning side of things. Overall scores didn't differ very strongly between the sexes, so it wasn't like one sex was simply smarter than the other. It was just the direction that they ended up going in was very different. And here's where investment theory falls a bit flat for me. If personal investment of time and energy is what drives your tilt, and more males are doing math than females, and more females are doing like verbal stuff than males, it just seems a bit more systemic than personal because of that big divide. I mean, are you really telling me that all girls just don't like math? It could be possible that society is investing differently in these skills and we're taught different ways of learning between young boys and young girls. I mean, personally, I think I'm an example of this as someone with a verbal tilt from when I was really, really little that ended up kind of bolstering that math tilt eventually. But yeah, between like the heavy gender bias in tilt itself and then the heavy societal bias towards STEM fields, I do think that there's just a bit of everyday sexism that we have to talk about. The STEM versus humanities divide could just as easily be a gender divide, and I think that there may be some everyday sexism at play there. Isn't it interesting that in response to the devaluation of fields that women tend to be good at, we see so much push for women to go into STEM rather than maybe valuing the fields that women tend to be interested in and going into? But that's just what I think. Anyway, we've established that choosing a STEM field does not mean that you're any smarter than someone who didn't. But if you've taken a STEM class, I know what you're probably thinking right now. Okay, sure, we might not be smarter, but we definitely work a lot harder in our classes. So that brings us to part 2 of this video. Do STEM students work harder? And honestly, the answer is a solid maybe for me. So Kevin Rask out of Wake Forest University identified low grade distribution in STEM classes, especially first-year classes, as a large factor as to why some students might start out in a STEM major and then end up leaving. You might be aware of this phenomenon from like weeding out courses in undergrad. Basically, the idea is, especially for places with less selective admissions, that you just have a really, really tough first year in undergrad. And this will weed out any students who might not be able to like handle coursework at higher levels. While this may end up causing some students to leave, it also makes the coursework in general a lot harder. And I feel like STEM classes really suffer from this problem. If you're someone who really likes STEM and you also really like a humanity, and then you take both in your first year, you might end up leaning towards the humanities just because the STEM classes in the first year were so hard to get your expected grade in. So yeah, average GPAs in STEM courses, especially in earlier years, are a lot lower than those in humanities. And when those distributions are lower, you do have to work a lot harder to get the same grade that you might want or expect in that class. So yeah, I can't really get around the fact that getting the grade that you might want or expect is a lot harder typically in a STEM class than like an arts class at the same level. But I would chalk that up to more of an institution problem rather than like students working harder or being smarter or dumber than anyone else. Honestly, depending on how you look at it, it seems like STEM students are just willing to accept that lower grade. This also mirrors my STEM graduate friends being willing to accept low pay to study the things that they really like to do in grad school, but that's a conversation for another day. So are STEM classes actually harder? Personally, for me, I did feel like they were. My neuroscience or biology classes had a lot more work associated with them, especially in the forms of labs, rather than my more psychology or humanities leaning classes. And I definitely worked a lot harder in those STEM leaning classes to get the same results that I wanted to get in those like psychology or humanity leaning classes. Generally, my bio classes did have a lot of memorization and, like I said, lab work, and they also usually had a math component, so that just made it harder. And you could point to that in general, that like STEM classes might tend to have more of a lab component, which would mean that you would have to invest more time than in a humanities class. But honestly, I know several physics students who would really much rather do like a lab than anything called a seminar where they might have to talk to people. So I don't know, maybe that one's a draw and based more on individual preference than anything else. I will say I did do a bit of looking at attrition rates, so rates of like dropping out or leaving a major to see if there was a difference maybe between STEM and humanities. And to be perfectly honest, I did expect that STEM students would end up dropping out more than humanities students. But I landed on this paper from Shang-Li Chen, and they found actually the opposite of what I expected. So humanities students ended up leaving their degrees more often than STEM students. So if you're assuming that at least a portion of students are leaving because the degree is harder, that point would actually go to the humanities grads. So sorry, STEM people. And of course, it often isn't the case that you're leaving a degree because it's too hard. You might leave because you have a change of interest, or maybe you figured that you could make more money in a different field, which often happens, in your first or second year of college. But either way, that point would have to go towards humanities. So it's a bit difficult to say who works harder. And I do think that this is a good point to mention that the trends that I'm talking about here are just trends. They say nothing about the difficulty level of an individual course or university. And you might have had a completely different experience from me. I mean, I know that if I was trying to take like German, French, and Arabic as a major or something, I would be dead, and those are humanities. So there are definitely cases that don't fit in with like the general statistical trends, and it can just be subjective in general. So yeah, I think that this one might be a draw because it can be really difficult to measure like difficulty, especially with each university and each course being so different. And that's where we get to part 3. Is the whole STEM versus humanities thing really a helpful dichotomy even at all? And honestly, I'm not sure. So even in the research that I was looking at, it was sometimes hard to actually define STEM or humanities. So like in the STEM case, occasionally neuroscience was included in there, and occasionally psychology was included as an art. Occasionally psychology was included as a science. So it really is like up to personal judgment of what is what. And honestly, I'd say that it's more important to be curious, regardless of what the subject is. And that's why I wanted to make this video. You guys are smart and capable and good enough to read research or learn things, no matter what the field is. I don't care what you've studied or what you enjoyed more in high school. I think that you are good enough to read a paper and learn about it. And I've been watching YouTubers. There are so many YouTubers who will start a video essay and then get to the more sciencey section of their video and immediately do a disclaimer like, I'm not a scientist, I don't understand statistics. And it's like, you are smart enough. I don't want to hear that anymore. I think that you are smart enough to read a paper like that and understand it, especially if you just work at it a little bit. I also think that exposure to the arts is really, really important in creating well-rounded STEM grads who are people and less like robots. It can be really important to maintain flexibility and problem solving when you're a STEM grad. And I do think that those are skills and attributes that the arts actually tend to hone in on more than the humanities. Not to mention the importance of history, especially this year, and history is a humanity. Fortunately for myself, I am not the only person who thinks this way. So there's this growing push for STEAM instead of STEM, which is basically adding the arts back into the sciences. And I would say that I am interested. So May and colleagues said it best in an article about integrating the arts into sciences and STEAM. Succeeding in this world isn't just about having the right skills anymore. These days, with the amount of information that's available to us, it's all about flexibility, learning new things, and being able to get creative when you have new information. So a more artistic or creative approach can allow you to think in new ways about new problems. And then you can always fall back on your more rigid skill set when you have to perform a brain surgery like we all do. My biggest critique of the whole STEAM idea is that sometimes it seems like people who are thinking and writing about it want to slot arts into STEM as enrichment for these poor STEM kids who are locked into a basement doing physics all day. Personally, I think this is a disservice to both STEM and the humanities because it treats entire serious disciplines as the mental equivalent of taking some kids to the zoo. Some of my most impactful classes were the ones where we learned about the philosophies of science, the histories of our institution, and especially the more hidden histories of my own discipline, neuroscience. So there's this paper I really like by Matiteri and Mela, and it's about some of the forgotten women in neuroscience, and I think that subject is really important. So a couple of the women that I really admire are Manuela Serra and Laura Forster. They were working in the lab of Ramon E. Cajal, who was instrumental in discovering neurons and what neurons actually do. Both of these women published drawings of neurons in spinal cords before neuron theory had even really been accepted. These were pioneers and women, and their drawings are published. So yeah, I do think that the humanities can be a great addition to a STEM curriculum, and learning about figures like that was really helpful to me personally. But fundamentally, I think that the arts need their own space to flourish. And I do worry that sticking them in STEM would just kind of infantilize everyone involved. And there are some serious missing pieces when we shoehorn humanities like that. One issue in my background of neuroscience is that some areas of study tend to lack a psychology-based theory to kind of base themselves around. We have all these resources to do studies about, say, Alzheimer's, but they can occasionally lack a real direction beyond incremental improvement because the psychology theory is so lacking. Sometimes it seems like psychologists and neuroscientists fail to speak the same language when we all have the same goal in mind. Personally, I think that my discipline would really benefit from taking psychology seriously and encouraging more thought in that direction rather than just taking incremental steps of improvement in our studies. And generally, I think that STEM as a whole would benefit from taking the arts a lot more seriously. Even if it comes to soft skills, these skills are skills that some scientists gravely lack. And honestly, your research doesn't improve just by you being a terrible public speaker. Seminars and small groups, which are characteristics of a liberal arts education, tend to promote collaboration and the ability to articulate your thoughts more clearly. And anyway, who wants to live in a world without history and art and language and dance and singing and music composition and media analysis and novels? That just sounds like a really boring and colorless world to me. So, what's my takeaway from all this? I would say that if you're worried that you're not smart enough to study a STEM subject, or if you're not like verbally acute enough to do the humanities, take that thought and throw it away. It is garbage. You are smart enough. We all need to be able to read and write, and we all need to be curious about the world around us. And I think that those things transcend disciplines. So do the thing that you like and work at it. Because no matter what your background is, you are, in all likelihood, perfectly capable of doing the thing that you want to do. So, yeah, are humanities and STEM grads that different? In my perspective, no, I don't think we are. I think that we are all just people trying to do our best. And some of us like to do little math problems, and some of us really don't like that. So, yeah, in conclusion, there's no real difference between us. So, anyway, stay curious. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.